Welcome everybody to the Philosopher Meet Critics, an event sponsored by Concept at the University of Cologne, directed by Dr. Sven Bernacker, and the Graduate Program of Philosophy from the Federal University of Bahia, directed by Dr. Valdomiro Silva Filho. My name is Felipe Rocha, and I am an Associate Research from the Federal University of Bahia, and I will be chair of this session. So, in this series, we will discuss published books, and we have the very authors address questions from other philosophers. Before introducing the participants of this session, I would like to tell you that we have already planned for the next session the following discussions. Annalisa Coliva, Extended Rationality, Christoph Kelp's Good Thinking, a Knowledge First Virtue Epistemology, Declan Smith's The Epistemic Role of Consciousness, Juan Comesaña, Being Rational and Being Right, Sandy Goldberg's Conversational Pressure. In this first installment of the series, we are going to discuss Dr. John Greco's book, The Transmission of Knowledge, which is just out from Cambridge University Press. Dr. Greco is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, and his work deals with virtue epistemology, skepticism, religious epistemology, and social epistemology. He is also the editor of the American Philosophical Quarterly Journal. We also have as participants Dr. Annalisa Coliva from University of California, Irvine, Dr. Maura Priest from Arizona State University, and Dr. Peter Graham from the University of California, Riverside. After Dr. Greco's presentation, which will take about 20 minutes, each of the participants will have about 10 minutes to comment, followed by a reply. I would like to thank all the participants for accepting the invitation to join the session. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. John Greco to start the session, telling us about the main idea of the book, The Transmission of Knowledge. Thank you all. Please welcome Greco.
Well, thanks very much, Felipe, and thank you to the Concept Group at the University of Cologne and to the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil for organizing this. And of course, thanks to you and to Sybil Schmidt, Waldemiro Silva Filho for organizing this. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the book with you all. And of course, thank you especially to the three commentators. It's really a privilege to have people give a kind of sustained attention to your work and then have a discussion about it. So I really appreciate that opportunity. Thanks very much for that. So I'm just going to use my time to briefly say what I'm trying to do in the book. I think that perhaps the main goal of the book is to try to locate and then begin to theorize what I take to be a distinctive epistemic phenomenon that has been largely left off the radar screen, certainly in the history of philosophy, but even to some extent in contemporary epistemology. And of course, that's the phenomenon that I call the transmission of knowledge or knowledge transmission. And to clarify what I mean by that, I think it's important to distinguish two senses in which the way people use this phrase, the transmission of knowledge. One sense is a pretty neutral, fairly pedestrian sense where nobody should disagree about the existence of the phenomenon or the nature of it. So the pedestrian sense is that sometimes a person knows something, maybe by perception or some other means, and then they testify to another person that such and such is the case, and then that hearer comes to know. And so that's just a straightforward pedestrian sense in which there's a transmission of knowledge from a speaker who knows to a hearer on the basis of that testimony. What I'm trying to locate and begin to theorize is a special and distinctive phenomenon, also sometimes called the transmission of knowledge, which is supposed to be something special and something that is different from coming to know in other ways. So, for example, by perception or good reasoning or some other means. So, in this special and distinctive sense, some people might deny that the phenomenon exists at all. They might think that you don't have to bring in this special phenomenon to explain the transmission of knowledge in the neutral and pedestrian sense. But other people have thought, no, this is very important and under theorized. So, for example, Michael Wellborn thinks that this is an extremely important epistemic phenomenon that almost nobody talks about. So that's what I'm trying to locate and theorize in the book. So how do I do that? Well, a key idea in the book is the notion of an epistemic community. And this is a technical notion. All I mean by an epistemic community is a group of people who share some set of information-dependent tasks and who share norms for evaluating the relevant information. And then there are a few points about epistemic communities that I think will help us to locate the phenomenon that I have in mind. So the first point is that an epistemic community so characterized is going to have two distinctive tasks with respect to the information it needs to perform the epistemic tasks required. So, so one task would be the acquisition of quality information, the acquisition that information of sufficient quality to be able to act on in the business of the epistemic community. And then the second task is to distribute that information once acquired to those who need it. So an example of an epistemic community, for example, would be a business corporation. And a business corporation has various information-dependent tasks that it has. And so one concern of the corporation would be to get good quality information that's relevant to its work. But then another concern would be to get that information to people who need it. Okay. So the second point is that because we want quality information, both the acquisition of information and its distribution is going to be norm governed. So that's why I want to talk about an epistemic community as not only needing the information, but sharing norms about what's going to count as high enough quality for its purposes. And then once we get that idea, it's fairly obvious, I hope, that the norms governing the acquisition of quality information should be different from the norms governing the distribution of that information. And the reason being is because the norms are really answering to different concerns. The dominant concern of information acquisition is quality control, right? The norms are in place to make sure that only quality information gets into the system. Whereas the dominant concern of the norms governing distribution would be to get that information where it needs to go, okay? So we would expect that the norms of distribution will not completely ignore quality control. So you'll want those norms of how we distribute information within the epistemic community to speak to quality control, but in a different way than the original sort of gatekeeping function of the norms governing the acquisition of information. Why do we expect the norms governing acquisition to be different from the norms governing distribution? Well, the reason is because a well-functioning epistemic community is going to want to take advantage of a division of labor, where we want there to be quality control of the information coming in, but then we don't want that task of quality control to just be replicated over and over again for every person that needs that information. We want to be able to take advantage of a division of labor that will take the epistemic burdens off the rest of the community once we've got information that passes a kind of quality control test. So in a well-functioning epistemic community, you would expect to see this difference in the norms governing information acquisition and the norms governing epistemic information distribution. Okay, so now the final point is that testimony and testimonial exchanges can be at the service of either information acquisition or information distribution within an epistemic community. So the obvious case, the paradigm case, would be testimonial exchanges within a community. So between people who are cooperating with respect to some epistemic task and therefore cooperating in the sharing of information. So that would be sort of a dominant role for testimonial exchanges. But you could also imagine cases where the speaker is outside the epistemic community, and so not in that kind of context of cooperation. In that case, you might use hearers within the community could be using speakers from outside the community to get relevant information. So for example, in a business corporation, sometimes you're talking with your colleagues within the business corporation, but other times you might be talking to a salesperson, for example, who's telling you about a product that you have to decide whether you're going to buy or not. Something like that. So if I could just share my screen for a moment, I think it's helpful to just sort of show what I have in mind. So I'm going to just bear with me for a moment, and I'll attempt attempt to share my screen here. Okay, so here's testimonial exchanges in two roles. So let the circle represent an epistemic community. And one thing you could have is a speaker and a hearer both within the epistemic community, and they're therefore cooperating in the distribution of information that's already in the community. But another thing that could happen is that you could have a speaker outside the epistemic community and the hearer using the speaker to get information in. So you might think, for example, that the speaker is a job applicant, the hearer is a personnel director, and the hearer is now going to have to figure out whether to believe what the speaker is saying, okay? So now the point is that the testimonial exchange at the service of distribution within the community among cooperating members is going to be evaluated according to different norms than the testimonial exchange where testimony is at the service of information acquisition, and you don't have that cooperative context between the speakers, okay? And testimony could serve either role. And so that's why then we can say that testimonial exchanges are sometimes at the service of acquisition, sometimes at the service of distribution, okay? Just to further talk about the idea, imagine you've got, again, this situation where the speaker is a job applicant. I'm going to draw it a little differently. Let's say the speaker is a job applicant and the hearer is the personnel director, and there's testimony there, and the personnel director has to figure out, use whatever evidence he has, whatever experience he has to evaluate what he can believe and what he can't believe. Let's say the job applicant testifies that he's had a certain job experience, and the personnel director checks references, does whatever other evidence gathering he needs to verify that information as, okay, that's good information that we can trust. Now the personnel director goes and tells his boss what he just learned. The idea now is that this testimonial exchange should be treated differently from this testimonial exchange. It would be ridiculous, or at least inefficient, if the boss had to do all the work or had to work just as hard as the personnel director before she can use that information. And that's, again, I'm talking about the division of labor there, okay? All right, so now the obvious move here is to locate the generation of knowledge, locate the transmission of knowledge in terms of information distribution within an epistemic community. So the idea would be, we will now understand the generation of knowledge as conforming to the norms of information acquisition, and we'll understand the transmission of knowledge as conforming to the norms of information distribution. So that's the general framework that I want to defend in the book. It's what I call the information economy framework, or maybe the knowledge economy framework, because it's modeled on an economy which, a material goods economy, in which there's both the production and distribution of material goods. And so the idea is, well, we've got both the production and the distribution of knowledge, and these are two different phenomena that have to be theorized differently. One can't be assimilated or reduced to the other. So in that sense, this is an anti-reductionist account of the transmission of knowledge. The transmission of knowledge can't be just simply reduced to the generation of knowledge. Okay. So that, I call that a general framework because I mean it to be consistent with various substantive epistemologies, right? So you might take on this framework for understanding testimonial knowledge and the transmission of knowledge as a reliabilist. You might take it on as an evidentialist. You might take it on as a virtue theorist. So the main purpose of the book is to defend the framework itself independently from wedding it to some particular substantive epistemology. And so the idea is that the framework itself is supposed to have significant explanatory power. So for example, it helps us to explain a range of testimonial cases where cases that you see in the literature, where some of those cases, it does seem like testimonial knowledge should be easy, that the speaker, the hearer doesn't have to do too much more than just trust the speaker for what she's saying, and knowledge will be successfully transmitted. So for example, when a mom tells the child that there's milk in the refrigerator, or when a history teacher is, or for that matter, a grade, a second grade teacher is teaching young children about whatever, the children sort of are in a position for an easy transmission of knowledge, right? Whereas in other cases, it seems like it would just be inappropriate for the hearer to believe what the speaker is saying without significant evidence and without significant epistemic work, so to speak, going into evaluating the sincerity and the competence of the speaker. So for example, in the situation we just saw, where the job applicant is talking to the personnel director, it does look like, well, in order for the personnel director to come to know from testimony here, he's got to meet significant epistemic burdens, whereas that seems much less so in the case of the exchange between the personnel director and his boss. So part of the explanatory power of this framework is to show why testimonial knowledge seems to be hard in some cases, requiring lots of evidence on the part of the hearer, whereas it doesn't seem to have that character in other cases, where there seems to be a pretty smooth transition of knowledge between speaker and hearer without a lot of work on the basis of the hearer. So obviously, the explanatory power resides in whether the speaker and the hearer, whether the testimonial exchange in question is at the service of the distribution of information between cooperating speaker and hearer in the context of an epistemic community, or whether that testimony is not serving that role. It's serving more of a role of information acquisition and therefore generating knowledge as opposed to transmitting knowledge. Okay. Another part of the explanatory power, another dimension of the explanatory power of just the framework itself, is it does give us, I think, a handle on some of the things that anti-reductionists in the epistemology testimony have insisted upon, such as the importance of the division of labor, the importance of trust and cooperation, the importance of the other non-epistemic relationships between the speaker and the hearer. So all these things are cashed out in more detail in the remainder of the book. But that's the general framework that I primarily want to defend. Okay, so that's my 20 minutes. There's a lot more in the book, but that's a good thing to just focus on for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, John, for your presentation. So now I would like to invite Dr. Annalisa Coliva to comment on John Greco's book. Annalisa, please welcome.
Thank you so much, Felipe. Thank you, Valdo. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to John for such a stimulating book. My comments will be based on a few chapters of the book. And the first comment I want to make is about this idea that amongst the testimonial episodes, we should really divide them into two groups. The ones that in which the information flow seems to be easy and the transmission of knowledge doesn't seem to depend on the hearer doing any further work, and the more difficult cases, as it were, in which the hearer has to do some further work. And you mentioned a couple of examples. In the book there are more. And the first set of cases, like the easy ones, are predicated on the presumption that the speaker is trustworthy, and by trustworthy I mean knowledgeable and sincere, knowledgeable with respect to what they're saying and sincere. And this presumption seems to be granted because of their role with respect to the hearer, in the case of the mother talking to her kid, or because of some issues having to do with the division of labor within an epistemic community. Some of the examples have to do with expert testimony vis-a-vis lay people. The other case is the ones more difficult, in which the hearer is supposed to do some further epistemic work, seem to leave open the possibility that the speaker is not trustworthy in the sense that I defined. And since the stakes are high, it seems important to double check. Now, I want to put a little bit of pressure on this dual understanding of these cases, because on the one hand, even in the difficult cases, supposing that the speaker is actually knowledgeable with respect to what they are talking about and sincere, there is some epistemically valuable information that is passed on from the speaker to the hearer. And the first question I'd like to ask is whether you would admit that in virtue of what the hearer is being told by the speaker, they have at least a prima facie justification or reason to believe what they have been told, just like in the, let's say, easy cases. But also, pressure can come from the opposite direction, and the reductionists can now say that also in the firmer set of cases, the easy ones, if we are really after the transmission of knowledge, so we are after the transmission of a more robust and stable epistemic good, even in those cases, the hearer might be required to do something more than simply taking the speaker at their word. For instance, they may have to check on the credentials of the expert in question or of the institutions for which they work, or they are required to have some kind of general knowledge of how these institutions work, so that the hearer can rationally take these institutions to have done the work necessary to guarantee that the speaker working for them is knowledgeable and sincere. On the other hand, one might, again, put pressure on this dual account of these testimonial exchanges by saying, look, if we focus on the minimal conditions for some passage of epistemically decent information, and we focus on something less than knowledge, namely prima facie justified belief, then we can treat all cases in the same way. And conversely, as I said, if we focus on the passage of more stable and robust information from an epistemic point of view, that is knowledge, I take it, then we might require more stringent conditions to obtain in both cases. So that is regarding chapter 1. Regarding your framework, you presented it very well, and I think that helped me at least clarify some of the issues. But let me ask a few questions based on my reading of the relevant chapter in the book. I had the impression that the distinction between knowledge acquisition and knowledge transmission was kind of unstable, particularly because I was connecting it to more, general cases in the epistemology of testimony, where it's not that familiar or typical to focus on the epistemic community at large. We typically look at what happens between the hearer and the speaker. So that is not really an objection. It's just that caught me by surprise, and having in the back of my mind that kind of literature, I'm going to ask questions that probably presuppose that kind of old framework, but maybe something useful will come out of that anyway. So in the book, at least, you seem to be saying that anytime new information is inserted into an epistemic community, that requires more work on the part of the hearer, because we want to make sure that good quality information gets in. When the information is just going around and it's not new, but it's somewhat has already been checked, as it were, the hearer doesn't have to do much in the way of further checking. But I guess that, as I said, based on my more traditional understanding of testimonial exchanges, then there may be a kind of relativity or context dependence having to do with the specific roles of the speaker and the hearer. There's a lot of information that is news to hearers, even if it's not news to specific hearers, even if it's not news to all possible hearers. And at the same time, there may be cases in which the speaker herself passes on information that is news to her, but which is already circulating in certain epistemic communities. So that, I'll give you an example, for instance. Think of two mathematicians that have independently arrived at the same proof of a given theorem, and only one of them has already informed some colleagues who have checked the proof and found it correct. So in this case, there is an epistemic community, however small it is, for which that is a piece of shared knowledge, why this is not widespread knowledge amongst all mathematicians yet. What is the hearer supposed to do when they are confronted with this kind of case? Or a similar example would have a gossiper who has just found out that A and B have an affair, when this is common knowledge to the close circle of friends of A and B. It's not clear what the relevant epistemic community is in these cases. And also, in the Fermat case, it's not clear how we position the hearer, whether they already count as being part of an epistemic community or not. So I thought that there were some strange predictions that your framework would make that didn't align with your treatment of the cases. For instance, in the mother-child case, the information the mother is passing on, namely the milk is in the fridge, just got back from the store, might be new to all the epistemic community. It's just a piece of new information, but that doesn't seem right that the child has to double check thoroughly before admitting, as it were, that piece of information into their belief or knowledge set. So I thought that there was something weird about this distinction between knowledge distribution or acquisition, or something that needed more explaining for me to really understand how it works and exactly what kind of predictions we can make based on that, and whether they align with some prima facie intuitions we might have, and that you are having clearly about these easy cases as opposed to difficult cases of testimonial exchanges. Okay, another quick point has to do with chapter 3, in which you place a lot of stress on the role of telling in the distribution of knowledge. And the way you understand telling is quite narrow in a sense. For instance, telling a joke wouldn't count as a case of telling by your definition of telling, which is that the speaker understands herself to know what she tells and intends that this knowledge be shared with the audience. And later on, you add that the audience understands and shares this intention, and there is some kind of cooperation agreement between the two to make things work. Now, it seems to me that there are many cases in which we get to know things, and we may even talk about knowledge distribution in your sense, in which we are not told directly by anyone anything. Cases in which we overhear a conversation, cases in which we hear someone speaking aloud, in cases of soliloquy. There may be even further cases in which, and these are definitely strange ones, but I think they are possible, in which the speaker is not really knowledgeable about what they are saying, but yet the hearer has enough information to get to know something by means of what they are told. And I have an example that I'm not going to discuss in the interest of time about that. So it's not clear that the fact that the speaker knows and intends to share her information is a necessary condition for this, for really saying that there is knowledge transmission. But then if you want to say, oh, okay, I'm just focusing on these very specific cases, then the account seems to be very ad hoc, and so its interest might be less than if it were able to account for the cases that we intuitively think are cases of transmission of knowledge. There are also cases in which, just based on the fact that the audience understands the intention of the speaker, it's not enough, I think, to have this passage of knowledge or information. Maybe the hearer doesn't have the necessary concepts or all the necessary concepts. They may not believe the speaker for whatever reason. And I think an interesting set of cases here that speak to this point is when due to identity prejudice, a speaker who's knowledgeable, wants to share the information, etc., is not, and the hearer recognizes their intentions, is nevertheless not believed because of this identity prejudice on the part of the hearer. So I wasn't entirely clear what the role of telling in all this was doing, because it seems to me that there are problems, both if we understand it as a necessary condition and if we understand it as a sufficient condition for knowledge distribution. And lastly, very quickly, I loved your chapter 6, where you extend the framework to consider cases of common knowledge, and you think of, for instance, hinges as cases of common knowledge. I think that is an incredibly original contribution, and so I'm just going to voice some little concerns, but really, I really appreciated that.
Well, coming from you, that's a good thing to hear.
Absolutely. I always love it when people make something out of it. And I'm not interested in exegesis per se. I don't care about that, at least not here. Sometimes I do, but not in this kind of context. So one thing I wanted to mention, however, is the fact that in uncertainty, many of the hinges are really passed on through testimony, like the water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, that Napoleon won at Austerlitz, or from textbooks, which by your books count as cases of testimony rather than common knowledge. And maybe the interesting question that this remark raises is how we get access to this common repository of knowledge that you think is constituted by hinges. Think of hair. It is common property in the sense that one just has to start breathing to access it. But hinges seem to be different. I don't have immediate access to the fact that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. I need to get it from someone or from textbooks. I don't even get it for free that all human beings have two biological parents, or that cats don't grow on trees. Rather, I would say I'm part of a community that passes on biological knowledge through education and therefore through teachers and textbooks. And these more specific pieces of knowledge, let's call them hinges, are a consequence of that training and upbringing, or as Wittgenstein would put it, of the word picture that has been transmitted to me. And we know that that word picture is constantly subject to changes nowadays. We can't even take that for granted anymore, that, you know, stuff about biological parents, and maybe in the future, pets will grow out of trees somewhat. So, final point. The problem seems to be that as soon as we admit that hinges are acquired, and you do admit it in the chapter at some point, they seem to fall into the class of knowledge acquired through testimony. Now, I do agree with you that part of the upbringing through which we acquire these hinges consists in having subjects internalize them so that they might be said to become items of procedural knowledge, which is what you claim. Yet it remains that at least at first, many hinges are acquired through testimony, broadly understood. So either they fall into two epistemic categories, namely the category of testimonial knowledge and of common knowledge, or else, if we focus only on their origin, they are just one more instance of testimonial knowledge. But either way, they are not, or not just, instances of common knowledge.
Good.
So I'm done. Sorry if I took a little bit more time, but I was so engaged.
Thank you, Annalisa. John?
Okay, so obviously there's a lot there. Those are excellent comments, and I could spend quite a bit of time on each point. But what am I allowed to do here, Felipe? How much time would you expect for me to take?
So about 10 minutes for each reply, and if we have a little bit of time in the end of the session, we can return to some discussion. Okay?
Okay, very good. So obviously, I won't be able to do justice to all of Annalisa's points in 10 minutes, but I'll try to address some. Okay. One thing that I think will help here is I I don't want the framework to imply that in cases of knowledge transmission, in this distinctive sense of transmission that is associated with information distribution within an epistemic community, I don't want the framework to imply that a hearer doesn't have to do anything. So I think the important point is, one, that the norms governing knowledge generation are different from the norms governing transmission. And two, that the transmission norms are designed to relieve the hearer of some of their epistemic burden, thereby achieving a division of labor. But that doesn't mean nothing is expected of the hearer. Now, there might be limit cases where pretty much nothing is expected of the hearer. So maybe the mother-child case is like that, but that would be a limit case, okay? And this goes back to the idea that both information acquisition and information distribution are governed by relevant norms in the epistemic community. So it might be that those norms are, well, it should be that those norms are not the same as for information acquisition, but they're still going to be norms, right? And I agree with you that this is somewhat context dependent. So for example, presumably, the norms governing the distribution of information among friends are different from the norms governing information distribution among mathematicians or among scientists, or something like that. Okay, so that's one point that I think is important. You're right that I'm imposing some categories here that you don't always see in the literature. And I think that's part of the project of the book, is to say that we do have to do some reorganizing of our categories in order to cut at the joints, so to speak. So one way in which the literature commonly goes wrong is to try to give one account for all testimonial knowledge. And that's where you get into this dilemma where it's like, well, some cases, it seems really easy to get testimonial knowledge. And so accounts that emphasize, say, having good inductive evidence about speaker competence or speaker sincerity, those don't seem to fit. But then there are other cases where it seems really easy for knowledge transmission. And those cases are hard for theories that try to emphasize just a trust or an interpersonal relationship or something like that. And so it looks like none of these theories can handle all of the cases well. So that's one of the main objectives of this framework, is to say you shouldn't handle all testimonial cases the same way. And then this distinction between distribution and acquisition within an epistemic community, that's supposed to give us, a framework for understanding why there are really at least these two sets of, the way I want to say is that it's not two kinds of testimonial knowledge, it's two ways of coming to know through testimony. One way of coming to know through testimony is to satisfy maybe the norms of good inductive reasoning applied to the speaker. Another way of coming to know is to satisfy the norms of information distribution within a community. That helps, I think, with the mathematician case, right? Because one reason that one mathematician can't just believe another mathematician that some theorem has been proved is that would be to violate norms of mathematical communities, right? I mean, you're not allowed to just, take that on, well, I guess it depends on the conversation, but let's put it this way. If we're both working on a theorem and I tell you, hey, the theorem's true, that's, you can't just believe me, right? But on the other hand, if we're doing some research together and our research depends on another theorem having, another theorem, I might tell you, actually, that theorem has been proved. The proof is available, you know, was done by so-and-so in this journal, something like that. Now, I would take it that, okay, now, you know that, and now we can proceed with our work. So the, you know, the norms will speak to when you have to prove the theorem yourself, and when you don't have to prove the theorem yourself because you're going to use it for something else that you're working on. So that would just be an example of, I think, your point that, you know, which norms are in play here are going to be determined contextually by the nature of the epistemic community and the nature of the information that is at issue. I hope that makes sense. The idea that not all testimonial knowledge is being handled the same way, that some testimonial knowledge you can think of in a kind of generation setting where, you know, the hearer has evidence that what the speaker is saying is true, and it's on the basis of that evidence that this hearer can evaluate the speaker and then come to believe what's being testified. That's sort of a, you know, that's a roughly reductionist picture in which testimonial knowledge is being reduced to inductive knowledge, right? It's a testimonial knowledge is being equated with knowledge based on good inductive evidence. And I want to say that that's a perfectly good model for some testimonial exchanges, namely the ones that are in the service of knowledge generation or information acquisition. So the framework allows and even predicts that some testimonial knowledge is going to have that character. The point is that not all testimonial knowledge will have that character, that other cases have to be handled in a completely different way, okay? So if we take that idea on board, then I think that helps with the overhearing case or the soliloquy case, or the non-knowledgeable speaker case. These would all be accommodated by the idea that sometimes the hearer does have good evidence in order to evaluate the speaker and what the speaker is saying in order to draw knowledge from that speaker testimony. But that would be different from the case in which the speaker and the hearer are actually cooperating and the hearer is trusting the speaker in the context of the speech act of telling, okay? So that goes to sort of another layer of argument in the book. So one goal is to defend this very general framework. Another goal is to sort of give more meat on the bones to this idea of transmission and knowledge transmission in the context of an epistemic community. And there I do invoke the idea that we have a kind of speech act that's dedicated to the transmission of knowledge. And I call that telling. And I think there's some, you know, I don't need to hang my hat on calling that telling. So you're right, that telling a joke wouldn't qualify what I have in mind. But nevertheless, there's lots of linguistic data that suggests that we use the verb telling in that way. So for example, if you ask me how I know something, it's a perfectly good answer to say, well, so-and-so told me. Or if I claim that I don't know something, you can say, but I told you that. Countering my claim that I don't know by saying that, well, I told you that. So this suggests that there is a sense of telling which is very closely related to the transmission of knowledge. But again, it's not related to all testimonial knowledge. It's only related to transmitted knowledge in the sense of transmission. In terms of the common knowledge chapter, I only have another minute, but in terms of the common knowledge chapter, I'm just happy to hear that you liked it because I know that you've spent so much time on Wittgenstein's uncertainty and related issues. In terms of how the hinges are acquired, and if we think of testimony in a broad enough sense, then they're acquired by a kind of enculturation, right? You just hear enough of what people are saying around you, and you sort of internalize this worldview, right? So I think that, in the chapter, I think that some hinge commitments should be treated that way. Other hinge commitments should be treated as just hardwired into human cognition. So for example, in the way that the perceptual system is structured in terms to, identifying mind-independent objects. But I think what I'm impressed upon is Wittgenstein's idea that there's one characteristic that he talks about of hinge commitments or hinge propositions in his terminology is that, he says, well, it's not as if I worked them out for myself. It's not as if I ever figured it out for myself that cats don't grow on trees, but neither did anyone ever tell me that cats grow on trees. So in other words, even if I'm acquiring sort of indirectly absorbing the idea somehow that cats don't grow on trees, nobody testified that particular proposition to me, right? And so that's what really impressed me in Wittgenstein, this idea that, well, it's not something that is typically asserted. These commitments are not typically asserted, and therefore they're not typically testified to. Neither are they things that I went through some, figuring out or working it out. So that speaks to a third category over and above both generation and transmission through testimony. And that's what I thought was so interesting about this idea of hinge commitments. I'm not sure that all of the items that Wittgenstein points to as hinge or identifies as hinge propositions will fit into this way of looking at them. I think that any account will have to do some cleaning up of the category and then try to give an account of what you think of those cases. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Annalisa. So as our second commentator, we have Dr. Maura Priest. Maura, welcome.
Yes. How's it going? So I had a lot of fun reading this. It was good to engage with this type of epistemology. I've been away from it for a while, so I agree with a lot of the problems you identified with traditional epistemic assumptions, especially about the overlooked social aspects of knowledge, and agree that many epistemologists are talking past each other and missing kind of a lot of the important and interesting aspects that are involved in the epistemology of testimony. And so I think my comments are, for the most part, I'm not going to disagree or directly challenge most of your claims, but suggest that there are alternative possibilities, so that there are ways to challenge many traditional epistemic assumptions, and there are ways to refocus the debate, bringing the social aspects of epistemology into the center, but rejecting the fundamental distinction you draw between generation and transmission. So that isn't going to say that your distinction is wrong, but just that there are ways to do similar things while remaining in some sense a reductionist. So I think that you can be a reductionist in that you think most, if not all, cases of knowledge are not importantly different from all cases of testimonial knowledge are not importantly different from other types of knowledge, and can be accounted for in ways that are not particularly different than other types of knowledge. And you could be contend that gaining testimonial knowledge has to demand more than simply believing in a trustworthy person, at least in most overwhelming majority of cases. So I think that somebody could take on these conservative positions and yet still being a radical. So a radical insofar as you reject the traditional schema and you're in favor of some type of revolutionary, socially focused epistemic framework. So I think you identified a lot of the flaws in traditional epistemology, but I think they're important flaws that you, well, I don't know if overlooked, but you didn't talk about. And these flaws explain why you can reject your central thesis about transmission and generation but still accept most of your auxiliary claims. So I think that cases of testimonial knowledge have been misunderstood insofar as what I would call unadulterated testimonial belief, I think, is really rare. And because it's rare, so is unadulterated testimonial knowledge. So I think that most, maybe all, but the overwhelming majority of cases called testimonial knowledge in the literature are actually more complex mixtures where testimony plays a critical yet non-exclusive justification role. So this claim isn't incompatible with your framework, but it suggests that examples of knowledge of transmission of the type you talk about must be rare. So I think that my personal reasons for belief, ones that we typically call testimonial knowledge, include that somebody told me X, but it's really rare that the fact that somebody told me X by itself would be enough to justify my belief in X. So, you know, I think that you might say, oh, well, there are some cases like the type you describe where people gain knowledge through testimony and something else, and that would be like a type of inference. But I think nearly all cases of testimony are like this. So I'm going to give a couple examples that I hope to show that most sort of classic cases of pure testimonial knowledge are not really that. So I'm waiting at a stop sign. I see a fender bender crash between a Toyota and a Kia. I believe and know that the Toyota driver was talking on the cell phone just before the crash. I believe and know this because I saw it with my own eyes. Another witness standing nearby also testifies that she saw it with her own eyes. The police testify that the phone records show the driver was making a call during this time. Due to the Freedom of Information Act, the phone records are released, publicly accessible, and I see with my own eyes that the record shows she made a call during this time. So I think all four of these could lead me to believe and know that the Toyota driver was talking on the phone before the crash. Some of these are testimonial and some are not. I know that the annual meeting for the Association of Skeptical Philosophers is canceled this year due to COVID. I know that because, one, I remember seeing an email that said as much. That might be enough right there to lead me to believe it's canceled. However, I also, at that time that I read this email, I know that that most academic workshops of this time are either canceled or online, and it fits all the backgrounds, my assumptions. So the case of children used an example of a kid believing that frogs eat bugs. His teacher told him that. So I think in this case, most likely the child is not justified merely in virtue of this testimony, but in virtue of the following: the child's understanding of the social role that teachers play in their community, the child's understanding about which types of statements are likely to be true and which ones are more at risk of being false, the child's foundational understanding about frogs and animals more generally and bugs and insects more generally, the child's observation of how others react when such a claim is purported to be true. So suppose that this child had never heard of a unicorn, and they had no idea what a unicorn is. The teacher then reads a story about unicorns, and the kid is taken in all this info about unicorns for the first time. The teacher then testifies to the class that she has a pet unicorn. So the child notices that other children in the class are giggling, rolling their eyes, expressing other signals of disbelief. So the child in this sense, is hesitant to believe their teacher. Contrast this with the case of the bugs. When the teacher testifies this, the child does not see this type of reaction. And I think the social fabric of knowledge includes the fact that they are maybe explicitly, maybe implicitly taking on how others react around them. And this simple case of a teacher testifying that frogs eat bugs becomes a justified belief that they could know, in part because the child notices that the social reactions of others are appropriate to this being the sort of thing that is true. So one reason, okay, so I think the cases in which there's pure, unadulterated testimonial knowledge would have to be something of the following sort. I had a hard time thinking of an example, but suppose that I am walking down the hallway in a philosophy building, and one of my colleagues that I know somewhat but not really well walks up to me and says, the New England sea turtle has an average lifespan of 11.5 years, and nothing else, and walks away. And I kind of look at him and I'm kind of confused, because that's a weird thing to just say to somebody. Do I believe it? I know this person is generally reliable, but the mere fact that they said it in this kind of context throws me off. So I think a case like this, you could plausibly say is some sort of pure testimonial knowledge, but I mean, even describing it, there's lots of reasons to think maybe they shouldn't know in this case, because it's just such an odd thing to say, and they don't really know this person's background about turtles. And so these kind of things I just think are rare, and I think testimonial knowledge is rarely just that. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the second issue I wanted to talk about, which is trust. So I think that trust plays an important role in gaining knowledge in some cases, and sometimes it's a role you say with the joint endeavor. But I think that there are cases in which people are a member of the same community, and in which they come to know something through the sort of situation in which most people would call sort of pure testimony. I would contend that, question that, but let's just say that most people would think of this as clearly a case of testimony, and that intuitively to me seems like it would be a case of transmission the way that you describe, but it also is not a joint effort of any sort, even though they're in the same community. So for instance, take somebody who, a family member, and we'll say two sisters, and then there's a brother, and the brother is getting into a lot of trouble in his life because he's being abused by his girlfriend, and his girlfriend is really taking advantage of him and doing all these horrible things. And so the sisters, they kidnap their brother, and they take him into a room, and they sort of give what's called in, psychology and stuff, an intervention. And they go, hey, look, and they tell him all this stuff, and he doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't want to participate. He wants to be out of there. But he's locked in a room, and he can't help it. And they're sitting there, and they're telling him things. And he has a lot of reason to believe a lot of these things. So I don't think this is a case in which it's a joint effort at all. It clearly is not. They're clearly acrimonious, and yet there is some way that this person can gather knowledge. And I think it could be explained by saying that sort of the joint effort is not merely between the two people that are, you know, exchanging, or the group of people who are exchanging information, but there could be some type of joint effort if you look at it more as a wider community, in the joint effort of the community. In some sense, I don't have time to go into it, but could explain why this is a joint effort, even if the person being told does not want to be a part of it. The last thing I'll say is trust could either be, you know, in the proposition or trust in the person, and I think both are a bit problematic. So if you trust the particular proposition, even when you don't trust the person, then it seems you could reduce trust to other factors. So suppose my boss, who I don't trust at all, I think he's an incredibly unreliable person, and I think 90% of what comes out of his mouth is false. But he comes up to me and he says, if you don't go to tomorrow's 2 p.m. meeting, you will be fired. And I believe him and I trust him, even though 90% of the time I wouldn't. And that's because the particular context of this situation is one in where I have reason to believe he would not be saying something false about this. Now take somebody else. I trust them very, very much. They're my closest friend. I think they're brilliant. They're very well informed. And they come up to me and say, look, there's a new cure for COVID. You have to take a bath in Epsom salt while taking 3 Tylenol pills. And they have this very serious look on their face. They're not a practical joke person. I know they're knowledgeable, and I trust them in an important sense as an individual. I think I'd have a lot of reason not to believe what they said, or to at least be skeptical in spite of it. And so I just think trust is pretty complicated, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maura. John, your reply?
Yeah, thanks very much, Maura. Comments that will not get their just due in 10 minutes. So again, I'll just try to make some helpful comments to the extent that I can. So I think I agree with you that unadulterated testimonial belief and unadulterated testimonial knowledge is rare, if I understand what you mean by that. And the way that I was understanding you was that it's rare that either a belief or knowledge is based solely on testimony, or the fact that you've been told, testified to. Yeah. Because why? Well, I can see 2 reasons why it wouldn't be just purely the testimony of being testified to. One is because you've got some evidence about the speaker in terms of speaker competence or speaker sincerity regarding what's testified to. So there's evidence, even if it's only implicit in the background, there's evidence there about the speaker. So you're not just merely believing the speaker independently of any evidence you have about her. And then another way evidence could come in is that you've got independent evidence for P. So it's not just because the speaker says that P, but you've got other evidence for P that can sort of go with the testimony. And both these would be kind of mixed cases. So I agree with you that being psychologically realistic, the unadulterated case would be rare, right? So I think this requires me to speak a little bit about what I mean by the kind of anti-reductionism that I'm embracing here, because on my categories, the reductionist position, or at least the standard reductionist position, like the Humean position, is that here evidence is sufficient to ground testimonial knowledge. And so anti-reductionism is just the denial of that in all cases, here evidence is sufficient to ground the testimonial knowledge. So on my categories, the mixed cases would count as falling into the sort of the anti-reductionist side of things. So from my point of view, it's not essential that hearers have no evidence at all for their belief to be appropriately. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. On my view, the anti-reductionist is not committed to saying that in cases of testimonial knowledge, the hearer depends on no evidence at all. The anti-reductionist is committed to saying that in not all cases of testimonial knowledge does the hearer need evidence that is by itself sufficient for knowledge. So if you were, think of it this way, the standard reductionist thinks that testimonial knowledge is just a species of inductive knowledge. Basically, there's nothing special going on in testimonial knowledge except the epistemically superficial fact that you've got inductive evidence about a speaker as opposed to something else, right? So that standard Humean reductionist position is committed to saying that in cases of testimonial knowledge, in all cases of testimonial knowledge, the inductive evidence that the speaker has to be sufficient for inductive knowledge in general, and therefore testimonial knowledge in this case. The anti-reductionist is simply denying that. So that anti-reductionist position is consistent with the speaker having all kinds of evidence. But what they're denying is that that evidence is going to be sufficient to account for the testimonial knowledge in all cases. So I think that I would be happy and in idea would endorse the idea that in most cases there is going to be relevant evidence on the hearer's part. I'm just denying that in all the cases we want to explain, that evidence is going to be sufficient to ground inductive knowledge according to the usual standards of inductive knowledge, in which case that inductive evidence has to be quite excellent. So for example, even in the small child case, child is going to have some relevant evidence, and you had some great cases there. But is that relevant evidence enough to satisfy the criteria for inductive knowledge in general? And I want to say no.
So you think that the child's background evidence, then he gets his testimony, those things combined would somehow fall short of the general criteria for inductive knowledge?
Yeah. They might figure into testimonial knowledge in this way, right? It might be that the norms governing the reception of testimony require that the hearer have some relevant background knowledge. But so long as you're not requiring that the hearer has the kind of background knowledge that would support inductive knowledge on the usual criteria, then you're still in an anti-reductionist position, on my view. So, I mean, one way that this comes out is that, you know, this is one of the reasons why I don't like the usual way that the literature divides things up. Because in the literature, reductionism is often characterized just how I characterized it. It's the standard Humean position that testimonial knowledge is just a species of inductive knowledge. Nothing special going on here. It's just more inductive knowledge, right? Then anti-reductionism is characterized as what I take to be a ridiculous position, that for testimonial knowledge, all you need is a speaker that knows plus no defeaters. That the speaker, what the speaker is. Now, I mean, maybe in some limit cases that would be enough, but to saddle the anti-reductionists with this idea that testimonial knowledge requires nothing at all on the part of the hearer except, say, an absence of defeating evidence, to me is that, well, that leaves open a huge logical space in addition to reductionism and anti-reductionism. So the way I do the categories is anti-reductionism is just the denial of reductionism. So basically, the anti-reduction is just denying that testimonial knowledge is, in all cases, just more inductive knowledge. How you fill out that anti-reductionist position is variable. One way would be in terms of default justification, you know, testimonial beliefs are innocent until proven guilty. That's not my way. My way is that you have to satisfy the relevant norms of information distribution, which are different from the relevant norms of information acquisition, but don't imply that the hearer carries no burden
So
at
which
all.
category you would fall into according to your schema seems like it will importantly depend on what it means to just be another category of inductive knowledge. And my guess is there's probably a lot of confusion or disagreement about what would qualify for just being another case of inductive knowledge.
So I think the case where the case where the job applicant is applying for a job and testifying about themselves to the personnel director, I think that's a plausible case in which, in order for the personnel director to, you know, do his job correctly, he better have excellent evidence that the person really does have, for example, the job experience that he has, et cetera. That's why, you know, you check the CV, you check references, you do you gather other kinds of evidence, including sizing up the speaker, et cetera, in order to make an assessment of whether the testimony should be believed. Another case in the book that I lean on is the police investigator interviewing an uncooperative witness, where, again, the police investigator better not just believe what he's told or trust the speaker. It's his or her job to assess that testimony. And how would it be assessed? Well, presumably on bringing together all kinds of evidence in a kind of Humean way about whether the person is likely to be telling the truth here. So the idea here is that if you're in that kind of position, which I would say, you know, where testimony is now serving information acquisition as opposed to distribution, if you're in that kind of position, even if the speaker does know what they're saying, and even if the speaker is telling the truth, it would be inappropriate for the hearer just to take the speaker's word without considerable evidence that the speaker can be relied on. Whereas I don't think that that's the mode that the mother and child are in, or the employee and the boss are in, or the teacher and the student are in, et cetera. Felipe, I kind of lost track of time. How much time do I have to answer?
I think it would be better to continuing with Peter Graham.
Okay.
And then if we have more time in the end of the discussion, we can come back to some questions, some points.
Okay, very good.
So as our last commentator, Dr. Peter Graham, welcome, Peter, please.
All right, great. Thanks so much. So thanks to Felipe, thanks to our colleagues at Concept at the University of Cologne, and our colleagues at the Federal University of Bahia in Salvador. Thanks to John for being John. John's just a great colleague. He's always got ideas. He's so intellectually honest. He's one of my favorite interlocutors. He puts his finger on good points. He gets us thinking about important things. He's clear. He's always a pleasure to read. And he's always someone worth disagreeing with, which I will do in my comments. The book is exciting. I'm so pleased that so many of us are writing books and writing articles on testimony. It's neat the way it brings together speech act theory, social science, individual social psychology, economics, evolution, all sorts of neat topics. I'd like to advertise that we're in a golden age of work on the epistemology of testimony. So it's true that Michael Wellborn did a lot by getting us, some of us, thinking about it a long time ago. And so did Tony Cody in the 70s. Lizzie Fricker's work, of course, was a great bridge from the 80s until the present day, and she's still going strong with so much work. But there are so many books that belong on your shelf right next to John's book. Joe Schieber's book on testimony, Axel Gelfert's textbook, of course, Richard Moran's book, bringing some of his important papers together. Ben McMyler's great book. We should have a collection of papers of Ted Hinchman. That would be so useful. Paul Faulkner's book was nice in drawing attention to the importance of social norms, sort of inspired by Bernard Williams, but that's sort of grown. John makes great use of some of the social norms literature in a later chapter of his book. This is something I've pursued independently and with our mutual colleague, David Henderson. There's also the adorable Sandy Goldberg, who's going to be in this series with another book later. Chris Kelp and Mona Simeon, both jointly and independently, are writing more papers on this topic. And of course, Chris will be in this series as well. And then there are just so many interesting and exciting younger scholars who have picked up this topic. A few that come off the top of my head are Andy Peet, Charlie Pelling, and Stephen Wright. So this is just an exciting time. So I'm glad that we're talking about John's new book. All right, I'm going to share my screen. I've got some slides. So I'm at the disadvantage of going over or making some of the same points our excellent colleagues Annalisa and Maura have already made, but I've got the distinct advantage of knowing what John would say about them, where I can enrich some of my replies. So let's see. Life is not a library. Questions for John Greco. Okay, so here are my questions. I'll preview them for John. What are the acquisition norms? So I want you to be more precise, and where I'll challenge you is whether they're really reductivist. I'm kind of on the other side of Maura, coming at you from, it'll turn out, the presumptivist point of view, as opposed to something maybe like the reductivist point of view. Second, what are the distribution norms? Are these norms that fall on the speaker or the hearer or both? So what I couldn't find when I was reading through are examples or clues that would tell me what the distribution norms are. And then lastly, what's wrong with presumptivism? So you just said you find the position ridiculous. To be frank, I find the reductivist position, to which you show sympathy, ridiculous. So we'll see where that takes us. Okay, we've talked about John's cases, his examples. At the beginning of the book, he gives 6 examples. So I'll just give these very quickly. A witness is talking to a policeman. Should the policeman just trust the witness? Our intuition is no. A job applicant says, yes, I've got relevant experience in that area. Should the human resources person just trust the job applicant? No. A stranger gives directions towards a cathedral to a tourist. Should the tourist just believe the stranger? Well, maybe the stranger should ask another person along the way to make sure they don't head off into the wrong direction. Those are cases 1 through 3. We can call those the top cases. Then there are the bottom cases, 4 through 6. A friend is asked, are you going to come to my party? And the friend says, yes, I intend to. Seems reasonable to believe at least your friend intends to come to your party. A 3rd grade teacher tells a student that France is a part of Europe. The student should just trust the teacher. And then a mother tells her child there's milk in the refrigerator. So Maura's emphasized how even in the bottom three cases, there's a lot of information or evidence that the hearer is likely to have. Even so, it feels like there are burdens, higher burdens on the top cases to have more evidence before you just trust what the person tells you, as opposed to cases on the bottom. So that's John's data that I think we all would accept. There's more to do on the top cases, less to do on the bottom cases. So the standard options in the literature, of course, are not just reductivism versus anti-reductivism. John is right that if we start with reductivism as a strict position that applies to all cases, then any position that denies that is anti-reductivist. So you can have a range of positions where there's the reductivist position, I'll define in a moment, and then less demanding, less demanding, less demanding to hardly demanding at all, the presumptivist position, which I will also define, but those are more or less the two standard positions. So presumptivism, Tony Cody has argued for this. Of course, it goes back to Thomas Reed, and you'll find this statement in Tyler Burge's 1993 paper, Content Preservation. Burge says, a person is entitled to accept as true something that is presented as true and that is intelligible to him unless there are stronger reasons not to do so. So someone tells you something, you've got no defeaters, you have a warrant. You'd be reasonable. You'd be in a position where you could come to know by believing them. So the key idea is that testimonial warrant occurs absent undefeated defeaters. Reductivism, on the other hand. Reductivism, I think, needs to be defined stronger than the way John has been putting it. So here's how I put it. A person is never entitled to accept as true something that is presented as true and that is intelligible to him unless the person possesses entirely, three times is a, should do it, non-testimony-based positive warrants for believing that the speaker's presentation is true, is likely to be true. So if you were to examine all of the warrants that the hearer has for believing the testimony, you have to make sure there's no reliance in there on the word of another that wasn't further warranted on the basis of non-testimonial support. Right? So it's the lone individual figuring it out all on their own, which is the reductivist idea. You've got to eliminate, if you're going to reduce testimony to non-testimony, you've got to eliminate testimony in your reductive base. So the key idea is that you have warrant only if reductively certified positive reasons for believing the speaker. That's reductivism. So the presumptivist about the cases says in the top cases, you've got a defeater and you need to defeat that defeater. And in the bottom cases, 4 through 6, well, there's probably no defeater, or if there is one, it's easily defeated, right? So the presumptivist would say, John, you're right. Cases 1 through 3, those are different from cases 4 through 6, but the presumptivist is one theory that treats them all. The reductivist, on the other hand, says, well, in each case, you need a reductively warranted positive reason. So all the cases on the top, you need such a reason. All the cases on the bottom, you need such a reason. Will the individual have genuinely reductive reasons in all 6 cases? Well, we usually argue about whether children have any reasons at all, and the claim is on the presumptivist part that they don't even have any positive reasons, but surely you can get knowledge from your parents, or at least warranted belief from your parents. But the reductivist also has to explain how we have warrants on the top level, 1, 2, and 3. Those cases, are they really genuinely reductive reasons, or are they simply reasons that come from, say, other testimony? So maybe your understanding about whether or not a witness is to be believed comes from training, and that training comes from testimony. You haven't seen the evidence in support of those training techniques. And furthermore, the people who developed the training techniques, maybe they relied on tons of testimony as well. So it's so social, our dependence on others for information, it puts a poor light on the reductivist position as I'm understanding it. All right, so John's book enters into the picture, the transmission of knowledge. And here's how I understand John's position. Both presumptivism and reductivism are false. They're false because they're totalizing theories. They say they've got the whole story covered. But then John says reductivism is true about some of the cases, 1 through 3. Presumptivism, or something like it, so not presumptivism, but something not too far, horribly far away, is true about the other cases, 4 through 6. His motivating analogy we've already seen as an epistemic community where there's information coming in, and then there's norms for the transmission of the information once it comes in. He thinks about scientific communities, though he used a business community as an example, but he thinks about scientific communities, and in part he's thinking about peer review. So there are norms for the acquisition of information and norms for the distribution of information for the community. I see this in clearer form as something like a library. What John has in mind is something like the truth, the Veritas library. And this is where there are librarians who do the following. They review all the incoming manuscripts. They read them very carefully. In fact, they have the power, the epistemic power, to reductively certify whether the manuscripts are true. So they're gatekeepers of truth. Then they catalog and distribute the certified books. And so the patrons who come and read the books are protected. They're sure to get only the truth. That's the kind of model. There's make sure it's good coming in, and then once it's there, you're golden. You can just read it. You're sure to get the truth. So John's view in the end, I call the Noah's Ark of testimony, because there's 2 kinds of knowledge. Now, he said that it's not 2 kinds, but 2 ways in response to Annalisa before. But on page 41, he says 2 kinds, not 2 ways. But it makes no difference. What's important is he says there are 2 different information functions, the acquisition distribution, generating 2 different norms, acquisition norms and acquisition and distribution norms, determining 2 different activities, what it is to conform to the norms. So there's 2 of each. The norms of acquisition, well, here's just a quote. I think we've got enough to see that he's got a reductivist picture, but I don't think it's reductivist in detail. That's what you're supposed to do when you're acquiring. So here's a question. It's not really about believing testimony qua hearer. Sure, when you're a hearer and you're in the acquisition role, check to make sure it's good before you put it in. But John is thinking about any information that goes in. So don't be careless when doing your own experiments or relying on perception or even introspection before you put it into the library. Keep the norms up high. So it's not about testimony per se, but it's also a norm for putting information into the pool. So there's a speaker norm when it comes to the acquisition norms. And then is the norm really reductivist? So I've pushed this idea already. You can even think about peer review, because when you do peer review, you're relying on tons of information that you've gotten from testimony. You're not a reductivist even when you're doing peer review. And so back to the point I made before, the policeman isn't really a reductivist when he's checking out whether he should believe the witness. Then there are norms of distribution. Now, these norms govern the distribution activities. But what I don't see is that John ever tells us what the norms are. What is the speaker supposed to do? What is the hearer supposed to do? What are exactly the norms? And surely there are going to be norms on speakers. And if there are norms on hearers, what are they? So he concludes by saying there are 2 kinds of testimonial knowledge, 1 kind for cases 1 through 3, 1 kind for cases 4 through 6, a reductivist kind, a non-reductivist kind, or a reductivist way and a non-reductivist way. My alternative is to think of John's cases, cases 1 through 3, in a special way, not as cases where you're putting on the hat of putting information into a pool, not where you're a librarian or a scientist, but you're just an ordinary person, and someone has told you something and you're aware that they have an incentive to lie. You have a deception defeater. That's what's going on in the first 3 cases. The policeman has such a case, the human resources person should have their guard up. But in cases 4 through 6, why would the person lie to you? Why would the mother lie to the child? There's no deception defeater, certainly not one that the recipient has. John's thinking, when he's thinking of the scientific community, when he defines the scientific community, is where we're cooperating. So what would be a case where you're not in a community with another person, where you're not cooperating? What would be your evidence that you're not cooperating with someone about information? When you are aware that they have an incentive to lie to you. So really, communities are just cases where you've got no deception defeater, and cases where you're not in community are cases where you do have a deception defeater. So why not presumptivism? Why not presume people are telling you the truth, that they're honest and sincere, unless you've got a defeater? So presumptivism, I said earlier, distinguishes the cases. That's exactly what John wants. But it states a simple norm for defeat. It states a simple norm that applies to hearers. If you can't defeat the defeater, suspend belief. It's not restricted to social context. It's a fully general theory. It's distinguishing two ways or two kinds of knowledge. One where you just get it from what someone tells you. Another one, you get it by defeating defeaters. And the defeating defeaters don't have to be reductive. So it doesn't move to reductivism to deal with his top cases, cases 1 through 3. So here are my questions. I've gone well over time, but to review, what are the acquisition norms? Are they really reductivist? Is that what you really want? What are the distribution norms? What are the details? Does it apply to speakers, to hearers? How does it work? And I'm not sure you've made a case against presumptivism. Lastly, the defense against the presumptivist makes against the kinds of points that have come up is to say that even if presumptivism applies in a limiting case, a very small case, it's the fundamental structure, it's where we start, and all the other support, much of that is going to come from testimony anyways. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. John?
Great, Peter. Crystal clear, as usual, penetrating as usual. And like the other commentators, just raising really excellent issues that I will not adequately address in 10 minutes. So I'll just stick to your format here. What are the acquisition norms and are they really reductivist? So let me just, this is an easy one because I can just agree with you. Okay, so if you're going to take reductionism seriously, it's exactly as Peter suggested. It's not just enough that you've got sufficient evidence. That evidence has to bottom out as non-testimonial. So any testimonial evidence has to be further reduced into non-testimonial evidence. I agree that that's the proper way to understand reductionism because it's reducing one thing to another thing. I also agree with Peter that it's entirely implausible position for the reasons he suggests. So I think that to sort of explain myself a little bit in terms of what I was doing in the book, I think I might have been overly concessive for dialectical purposes on this point. So what I should have said probably more carefully and explicitly than I did was that at best, the reductionist has a good approach to some cases on one end of our spectrum. But I agree and endorse pretty much everything Peter said about reductionism. What are the distribution norms? Do they apply to the speaker, the hearer, or both? And he's right, I never say what the distribution norms are. One reason I don't say what they are is because, again, I'm trying to defend a general framework that could be wedded to different substantive epistemologies. So an evidentialist would think of those norms one way, a process reliabilist would think of them another way, a virtue reliabilist would think of them a different way. And so I didn't want to commit on that point. So that's one reason why I was vague on that point. What are the norms? But another reason I was vague on that point, just as important, is because I think those norms are going to be different for different epistemic communities. So I really buy into this idea that knowledge is for the purpose of action. Knowledge has to be good enough to act on. And what that's going to amount to is going to be different for different epistemic communities depending on what the information dependent tasks for that community are. So I think the distribution norms for a scientific community at large is going to be different for the distribution norms, say, of a business corporation, which are going to be different for the distribution norms of a family of, maybe a family or a group of friends, et cetera. So that's two reasons why I've remained vague on what exactly the distribution norms are. I do think, however, that they apply to both the speaker and the hearer. So I think in any epistemic community, there are norms governing what you should say and how you should say it, and there's norms governing who you should believe and what you should believe, et cetera, when in that role. So so that's that. Why not presumptivism? Okay, so again, rhetorically, I was being too strong to say it's a crazy theory. It can't be that crazy if Peter endorses it, and a lot of people endorse it. However, I don't think I was exaggerating too much. I do think it's pretty crazy, and Peter's absolutely right that there are resources in the presumptivist position to handle the different cases. The question is, how elegantly and smoothly are they handling the cases, and what other explanatory power comes with that framework. So I did not in the book, probably one of the faults of the book, or one of the weaknesses of the book, is a lack of serious engagement with alternative positions. What I was really trying to do is, one, rearrange our categories a little bit in a way that I think cuts better at the joint, so that we talk past each other less and make more progress in the literature. And two, I really want to display the explanatory power of this framework, because I think in the end, that's how you judge the different theories, is in terms of their explanatory power, not on the sort of close quarters, hand-to-hand battle on specific points. But let me just say one thing, I think, and it's just one thing that I think counts against presumptivism. I think that if you reflect on the norms that actually govern our reception of testimony, and let's focus on cases where we're plausibly within an epistemic community. Even within the epistemic community, in a context of cooperation, I think we typically are required to do more than what the presumptuous asks of us. So so often I think believing so long as there's no defeaters just isn't living up to the norms that we're required on hearers. So I used the example of a military base, the analogy of a military base, where certainly you have to satisfy some pretty high standards to get into the base in the first place. But once you're in the base, you don't get to just go wherever you want, unfettered. People can stop you, check your ID. There are going to be rules about where you can go, where you can't go, when, etc. And so the norms governing getting into the base are different than the norms governing how you get around the base. But it's not like, you're just free to go where you please. I don't know what the analogy to the no defeaters clause would be there, but close enough. And then there was one more thing I thought was relevant here. Yeah, so this does not come out in the book, again, because I don't engage alternative positions closely. But I think what I would say now is that for me, again, if we reflect on the norms that actually govern us, they do apply not just to the hearer, but to the speaker. So I think that an adequate account of the transmission of knowledge looks at it as a speaker and a hearer cooperating together within the context of appropriate norms. I don't think the presumptivist really says enough about the speaker. It's really all about the hearer. So that's one way in which the reductionist and the presumptivist sort of share a kind of attitude. As far apart as they are, they're really only talking about what's required of the hearer. Whereas I think in order to appropriately understand the transmission of knowledge, you really have to look at speaker-hearer cooperation and the idea that that cooperation is itself norm governed.
Okay. I think we have time for some final thoughts. John, if you want to add more to some other points you didn't have time to address, or some quick follow-up questions. We have a few minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much I could say. Maybe, okay, just one more case. One more point, and then I think probably more productive to field follow-up questions. But one more point that, again, I think I say it in the book, but I probably don't emphasize it enough, is that I think that the basis for testimonial knowledge is in many cases overdetermined. Okay, so the idea is that, you know, in a typical case, when you're operating within an epistemic community, and on my view, it's really distribution norms that should govern. In many of those cases, you could satisfy the acquisition norms because you have enough evidence and you have enough other epistemic resources to sort of switch in to non-cooperative mode and assess the speaker. The point is that that's not always the case. And so without this distinction between two ways of coming to know through testimony, you wouldn't get an account of the full range of testimonial knowledge that we think we have. And the other point is that you don't need to do it even when you have it. So in other words, even with an epistemic community, the first point is lots of times you do have sufficient evidence that, you know, would satisfy the standards of acquisition, but you don't always. And then the second point is, even when you do, you don't need it. That's not what's going on. That's not what's explaining the epistemic phenomenon that we're trying to explain. It would be if you were to see. I think that the relevant epistemic phenomenon are psychologically real. This is something that Peter and I were talking about in a different context recently. The epistemic phenomenon that are important here are psychologically real. So the question is, even if in a cooperative context, the hearer has adequate evidence about the speaker to ground inductive knowledge, say, is it true that they're using it? And is it true that that's what is the basis of that transmission of knowledge? And I'm saying no, even if lots of cases it would be there to be used if needed. Okay, that's just another point, because I think that one way I think I could be misunderstood is saying that, well, in cases of transmission, you don't have appropriate evidence about the speaker. That's not really the point. The point is that you don't need it. That's not psychological. That's not the phenomenon. That's not what's explaining the transmission of knowledge. It's this other stuff. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's do some really quick follow-up questions. And Peter already raised the hand, so Peter, please.
Thank you. John, once you deny strict reductivism, I think you're committed to saying that when someone tells you something, that can provide some warrant, some justification on its own to believe what they've told you, absent defeaters. In other words, there's going to be some, however rare, pure, unadulterated cases where you can acquire knowledge from what someone tells you, absent defeaters. Or weaker view would be, well, you acquire some consideration, because reductivism is motivated or is committed to the view that says that someone has told you something, that someone has asserted that P is epistemically worthless vis-a-vis P. It may be evidence that they believe P, or that they speak a language, or they understand these concepts, but it's zero reason to believe anything whatsoever about P. That's right. That's why it's got to come, if you do have a reason to believe P, it's got to come from somewhere else. So I think what the position you favor is a spectrum position. There are some cases, like the policeman, who you need more evidence from other background information or other information you could go acquire before you trust someone. And then there are cases like the third grader, where you need less evidence. And Moore is right in pointing out that even the third grader will have a degree of evidence. So I think you've got a spectrum view, not that there are two kinds, not that there's a cut in functions. So the norms of acquisition and norms of distribution, I think that's kind of orthogonal. I think that goes to cases where, given the structure of certain kinds of communities where information comes in and then we want to just share that information, we have different degrees of responsibility. So you're right that there are those kinds of cuts for those kinds of communities. But when it comes to the epistemology, fundamentally, it's about differences in degree as to how much epistemic work is expected of the hearer, depending on the context and the subject matter.
Well, am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Okay, so I agree with you that there is a kind of spectrum of how much is required of the hearer. Okay, so I agree with you that, and in a couple of different places I give the list of cases. And the cases is really supposed to show a spectrum, right? It's supposed to, like, it just gets harder and harder, or easier and easier, depending on which way you're going up and down the list. So I agree with you that. But I think that so 2 points. One is that it's the notion of an epistemic community, and the distinction between information acquisition norms and information distribution norms relative to that community. It's those resources that explain why there's a spectrum. So one element of the explanation is sometimes you're in the distribution mode, sometimes you're in a acquisition mode when you are engaging in testimonial exchanges. And another point is that different communities require more or less for even distribution, depending on which norms are the appropriate ones for that community. So these theoretical resources of epistemic communities and the two tasks of information acquisition and information distribution, those are being brought to bear to explain why there's a spectrum of more or less required on hearers in different cases. And then the second point is that I don't think that our range of cases is fully explained if you're only talking about what's required of the hearer. I think that part of the story of why transmission was successful when it is often requires talking about the speaker and they're playing, well, actually always requires talking about the speaker and they're playing the appropriate role. So again, I don't think you're going to fully understand what's going on in that range of cases if you're only thinking of it as in terms of what's required on the hearer side. You've got to, I think, to fully understand the phenomenon that I want to bring into focus. You know, that chapter on joint agency, I think, is an important one for cashing out this idea that transmission isn't just about the hearer, it's about what's going on the speaker side as well. And that's what's really nice about the joint agency framework, is that it itself allows for and explains the variable contributions of speaker and hearer. So think of the analogy of passing a ball in a joint action sense, in which two people are cooperating to throw the ball from one person to the other person, so that you know, they're both intending to do that together. That allows for varying contributions from the receiver and the passer. If you've ever tried to teach a young child to catch a ball, you know that the adult thrower has to do pretty much all the work, right? I mean, if the kid is young enough, you have to place that ball right in the hands, right in the right way, at the right angle, with the right amount of force, so that that kid can catch the ball. Now, she really does catch the ball, and so it was a cooperative success, but it required very little on her part in order for that joint success. And then you compare that with, you know, a quarterback passing a ball to a highly skilled receiver who has to make a tremendous contribution on their end in order to complete that pass. So I think of the transmission of knowledge as mirroring that kind of variable contributions from speakers and hearers in order to achieve the common goal of getting knowledge to go from the speaker to the hearer.
Right, Maura, I think I saw you raising your hands. Yeah, and then later, Annalisa, very quick follow-up questions. Okay, Maura, your mic. Yeah.
Okay, so you know, as far as the claim that, well, yeah, in most cases there's lots of background information, and so you can have justification for knowing something that is in some sense over determined. I guess I have three worries about that. So you said the thing is you don't need that background information. Well, I guess I would say in most, I don't know, in many cases, I don't think it's overdetermined. I think that when somebody testifies something, you know, because of the combination of the background information, which wouldn't be enough by its own, and then the testimony. But even if that's not true, if it is overdetermined, then I worry that, you know, saying, well, you could know just on their testimony, it's still not how we psychologically work. I think we are always evaluating testimony and sort of putting that in perspective with all the things we know. And that seems kind of important. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that's how we psychologically work, but if so, then I think there needs to be an argument for why we don't work psychologically that way. Because if it's true we do work psychologically that way, then what you are describing is, I don't know, not what actually happens, but it seems important to your theory that you want to describe sort of what actually happens in communities. And so if we really are, when somebody testifies to us, thinking of it in perspective of with all the background information, then I don't know, that seems relevant.
So Maura,
yeah.
just for clarification, I hope I didn't say that background information isn't needed and isn't relevant. I would say that background knowledge, I would think would have to be involved in some way in any case I could think of, It's just that it wouldn't be involved in the way that the reductionist thinks it has to be involved, where that background knowledge is acting as sufficient inductive evidence in order to support belief in the proposition.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood what you just said sort of after. I thought you said this like 10 minutes ago, or 5 minutes. Maybe I misunderstood that then. I guess so then this is sort of it's not so much a question for you as a worry about the entire, I don't know, all of this, is that I wonder to what extent are reductionist and presumptionists talking past each other. So, you know, you can trust someone unless you have reasons not to trust them. Well, that could be a trivial claim if in, 90% plus of cases, you have reasons not to. Or you can't trust someone unless you have reasons to trust them. Well, again, what if it's, the case that in 90% of cases, you do have reasons to trust them? So it seems like they almost, if you just describe them like that, they could be reduced to almost the same position, depending on how common it is to have reasons to trust someone or have reasons not to. And I just kind of wonder how many people hold these extreme views and the extent to which they're disagreeing. Yeah.
No, good. And here's a way in which I think might follow up and endorse what you're saying there. So one way to understand presumptivism, and maybe it's not Peter's way, I suspect it's not, but one way of understanding it is that they're articulating an epistemic norm that is kind of self-standing. So it's something like an a priori synthetic epistemic principle that you have prima facie justification or warrant on the basis of testimony so long as you have no undefeated defeaters. That's a position that I think for various reasons is not a good position. Now, it might be true descriptively that many times if you believe somebody on the basis of testimony without any undefeated defeaters, that will in fact generate a positive epistemic status. But the reason that is descriptively right, on my view, is because in that situation, acting that way will be sufficient for a reliable exchange of knowledge between the speaker and the hearer. So at bottom, the epistemic norm that's doing the explanatory work there is this kind of reliabilist framework that says, when certain norms are in place and when those norms are satisfied, you in fact get a reliable transmission of knowledge from speaker to hearer. So the fact that in some cases that's underwritten simply by believing the speaker in the absence of defeaters is a kind of superficial epistemic fact, not a fundamental epistemic norm. So
that makes me think, I wonder how much somebody like Thomas Reid, who is, some sort of presumptivist, would disagree with what you just said, because he talks about, look, as humans, we were made to be the type of creatures, are, I don't know, he says something like, we can reliably do this in just the way that our eyes are reliable. Right. Humans were made such that test. So I wonder where, how much of this is really disagreement, I guess.
No, that's a great point, because I think Reid's a perfect example. So I think that, Reid is often portrayed as a presumptivist in this sense that, it's a fundamental epistemic norm about testimony that it's innocent, testimonial beliefs are innocent until proven guilty. I don't think that's right at all, for the reasons you just said. I think Reid is a kind of proper function reliabilist, It's a matter of proper function and de facto reliable function that, and this is why he talks about the principle of credulity and the principle of, I think, veracity, coming together to create reliable testimonial exchanges in a way that's properly functioning for human beings. I think that's close to Peter's position as well. But then it's not presumptivism that's doing the epistemic work. It's the proper functionalism and the reliabilism that's doing the epistemic. And insofar as the presumptivist norm is true, it's true because these other things are true. And I would also say that it's not true in all the cases that we want to explain.
Great. Annalisa, please, and last questions.
I don't think it is a real question. It's more like a comment. Clearly, there are many different understandings of what reductionism is or what presumptivism is. I wouldn't agree with Peter that has such a strong take on reductivism, such that it's really makes testimony inessential. And I think that the point, for instance, for someone like Hume is to say that if you have to, to believe what you're told and get knowledge from testimony, then there has to be inductive evidence in favor of the fact that the speaker or speakers are generally reliable. That doesn't mean that you could otherwise get the information from, that you are getting from testimony just by doing all the work yourself. So maybe you are aligning yourself more with Freaker's views. I don't know exactly. And I wouldn't agree either that Reed is the presumptivist whose ultimate justification for presumptivism is reliabilism. It is the fact that God made us the creatures we are, and these principles have been instilled on us, and He gives I would think, a nuclear justification for that by appealing to God's existence and the fact that He built us in a certain way. But this is just to say that it seems to me that after all this long discussion that really reductivism and anti-reductivism or presumptivism are not the point of your book, that you're not really interested in engaging that debate that much. And you don't, in fact, as you said, you don't go to great lengths into any of these views to distinguish yourself from any of these possible views. There are families of views, and you are really, really focusing, I think, on a very specific phenomenon that actually you consider in a very narrowly defined way, which is the transmission of knowledge, particularly the distribution of knowledge, and maybe the role of gatekeepers. So I wonder if at the end of this conversation, we might just leave these more traditional ways of cashing out the debate about testimony in the background, and maybe the take-home message is really we should be looking at something much more specific, which may or may not interact with this family of views, traditionally called reductivism, anti-reductivism, or whatever have you. And that is the new contribution that you are making to the debate. So another question, a comment, as I said.
Well, so thanks for that. And that is sort of the spirit. The spirit is to say, look, reductionism, anti-reductionism distinction is drawn in different ways. The notion of transmission is understood in different ways in the literature. So what's really important, I think, from a theoretical point of view, is that we realize that none of us are doing ordinary language analysis here when we say this is what reductionism means or this is what transmission means. What we're doing is we're trying to bring to bear theoretical categories that we think are useful. So there are different ways to draw these distinctions. There are different ways to define these terms. They're going to carry their weight insofar as they're theoretically useful at, as I say, like cutting things at the joints, getting us to understand the phenomena that we want to understand. So I agree with you that much. And I guess, for full disclosure, I mean, I do say in the book that I think some of these other ways that I reject and that my terminology is replacing, I think they're more obscuring than enlightening of the relevant phenomena. I think that when you define reductionism and anti-reductionism in a way that they don't exhaust the possible positions, that's just getting us now into talking about all these mixed views. And to me, it's just an inelegant, unuseful way of cutting things up. So so I guess I take I agree with you that it's not the terminology that's important, is the substantive views. But the other side of that coin is I do think the epistemology of testimony has been hindered by some of the standard uses of this terminology. Yeah.
Okay, great. So once again, I would like to thank you all, John Greco, Annalisa Coliva, Maura Priest, Peter Graham, for this amazing discussion. And also, I would like to thank To Concept at the University of Cologne and the Graduate Program of Philosophy from Federal University of Bahia for organizing the Philosopher Meet Critics. It was a great session, a lot of inspiring thoughts. I think everybody is happy with the discussion. And once again, thank you all for accepting the invitation, for being part of this first session, and hope to see you all in the next sessions. Okay?
Thanks so much. Thanks so much to everybody. I couldn't have asked for better commentators. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Cheers.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.